My name is Danelle Presky-Hushka, and I work for the North Dakota Association of Counties, and I'm going to kick this session off on the challenge of fighting fake news. Well, fake news has definitely been in the news and making headlines a lot lately, especially in the last 7 months. President Trump, I think this headline or what he made a comment about fake news is very telling, that fake news is the enemy of the people. It is not targeting or attacking just that person that the fake news is about. This is really about what the fake news is going to do for our society, for our citizens, for the American public. How trusting are they going to be moving forward of the news that's coming out? Well, fake news isn't just a Donald Trump issue. Fake news can happen anywhere. And today I'm going to give you some examples of my encounters with fake news in just the last few months and how it affected one very rural, quiet county in North Dakota. This is Morton County, and the population there is 30,000 people. As you can see by the picture, it is very rural. 1,900 square miles and 34 sworn deputies. Why did fake news happen there? Well, it started with the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. And a 7-month-long protest that attracted 12,000 people who were doing anything and everything to try to stop the construction of an oil pipeline that started in North Dakota and went down to Illinois. The heat of the contention was right in Morton County, where the pipeline was going to be crossing the Missouri River. I'm not going to get a lot into the protest or what all happened behind it, but I just want to point out, as you can see on the map to the left, that the pipeline never crossed into the reservation below that's shaded in yellow. It was always in Morton County and through other counties. In fact, the pipeline was really built on 98% private property. Of course, oil development is controversial. That alone causes activist groups and politicians to engage. And many factors went into creating a complicated, ongoing situation where citizen journalists and activists were using social media to spread messages to gain momentum for their cause. In many instances, this resulted in false accusations about the actions of our law enforcement. Just a couple pictures there to explain some of what they did to try to stop the construction was create barricades, and that barricade is on a state highway on your left, using North Dakota state signs to create a barrier along with hay bales and other materials. On the right, you see the picture of them actually on the construction area and them being on top of the actual pipeline that was to be buried in the ground. As I mentioned, I'm employed by the North Dakota State Association of Counties. However, Morton County realized early on that they needed a public information officer, and they didn't have one. They reached out to the Association of Counties to see if they would be willing to loan me to Morton County. We thought it would be maybe a couple weeks, and it ended up being, for me, 3.5 months, and then I came off and other people came on. So they really had no one in the beginning to respond to any of the emails or calls or to issue press releases, and I hit the ground running. A week after I came on, the state declared an emergency. And so that lifted or brought in state assistance. So other PIOs were brought in through the Department of Emergency Services, which was greatly appreciated. During the length of the protest, there were 4,000 media engagements. That's via email, voicemail, phone calls, in person, interviews, and as I mentioned, Morton County had no PIO, and assistance was very needed. So some examples of the fake news that we encountered. This was pretty early on. The graphic was shared all over social media. They were claiming, protesters were claiming on social media that this girl had been attacked during a clash between protesters and Dakota Access Pipeline security officers who were actually on a construction site. We were able to track this back to a picture that was taken in 2012 of a dog attack in Texas. So that was really our first encounter with, okay, we got to really watch out what they're putting on. Dakota Access Pipeline protesters repeatedly engaged in fake news practices, spreading false information and claiming serious injuries were caused by law enforcement, and they were backing this up with false images. Another example, a post again on social media that law enforcement were raiding the protesters' camp and they were setting the teepees on fire. I don't know how many of you have been to North Dakota, but we don't really have a forest like that. It's pretty barren. This picture was actually linked to be from a scene from a 2007 movie. There was no connection to North Dakota, and like I mentioned, the residents there knew it. Another thing, repeatedly protesters would claim on social media that, and through their own releases that they would put out, that Morton County law enforcement were jamming cell phones so that they couldn't post on social media or use their phones. Well, the reality is that this area where this happened is very rural and has always had very spotty cell service. You know, there's lots of hills and it's remote. So the lack of service really had nothing to do with the protest. In fact, authorities worked to even put up a booster in that area so that if there was an emergency at the camp, that they'd be able to reach emergency services. So really couldn't be further from the truth. They were also claiming with the helicopter picture that we were using cell phone monitoring to find out where they were moving and what they were doing next. Well, as you can imagine, there were many arrests. I think the total was over 700 people were arrested during the length of the protest, from anything from criminal trespass to attempted murder of an officer. Most of the time, those arrests were made in mass numbers. So you might have one incident where they were blocking a road or on private property, and you would make 100 or more arrests. Well, Morton County didn't have the room for 100 inmates. Vicki, do you know how many jail cells the Morton County has? I don't know. So, in order to accommodate when they would bring in the large volume of inmates, they decided to make temporary holding cells in a garage. And that's where the people would be held until they could be transported by big buses to other jails in the state. So, of course, this really blew up, saying that they were saying that they were being held in dog kennels. And when you think of dog kennels, what comes to mind? Like a smaller chain, smaller fenced area, when these were actually, pretty roomy areas and really were not anything like a dog kennel. We eventually just took pictures and just gave those to the media and said, no, this is what they are. And then we would actually take the media back in there when there were no inmates in there to show them what it really looked like. For months, the highway was shut down because, number one, there were lots of protest marches that were going on the state highway, and so you wouldn't know if traffic would be coming to or from on that road and encounter, you know, a whole bunch of protesters that would be walking. It was just a very dangerous situation. And so the road was closed, and there was a detour that was provided that wasn't that much further than what the direct route of that road was. And then there was another situation where protesters set vehicles on fire on a bridge on a state roadway. And because of the integrity of that road being in question, they had to shut down that bridge because you didn't want them using a bridge that could fail. But all along all this, law enforcement were being accused of illegally blocking a public roadway when actually it was shut down to protect the safety of not only the motoring public, but also the protesters as well, who might be walking on the road and traffic coming along. So just some examples of what we encountered. We had in January not only a new president, but a new governor. And that really created a whole new wave of how are we going to handle this situation. Even though our governor was from the same party. He just had provided a lot new leadership. He authorized a new website to be used to disseminate information, and a whole new attitude, and also brought in more resources for the public information side. We released a number of releases called Myth versus Fact to try to target some of the examples that I showed you. But as you can see there, it's like 23 different examples of myth versus fact. They also brought in a Louisiana Sheriff's Department video team to help them launch Know the Truth videos. And this was shared on social media and then also put into news releases to share with the media that were covering this. And I am going to try to play one here for you.
Law enforcement respects everyone's First Amendment rights, but there is a peaceful way to do it. Protesters are using social media to get their educated message to the public. Know the Truth is a series of videos to provide the public with accurate and factual information coming directly from my agency. These are short narratives that will tell you the real story of what's occurring in our communities.
Many of the people in here are peaceful culture. We don't meet those people and have good conversations, or they do a certain way they leave. We never have any confrontations with them. There's definitely a group in here that uses them as their disguise. A lot of people wonder why do we need to defend this area so intently. Well, if you look behind us, I think 6 goes right up the road, and that's where all the private property is that we pushed everybody off on October 27th. Once we got about private property, we stop. That's our goal, is to enforce the rule of law, not to have a confrontation with the protesters. They want back through, because they know if they can get back through, they can get up to the drill pad site, they can get to the area where the workers are. I guarantee you, if they get through us, there's going to be people being hurt because they will confront the workers up there and they will defend themselves. And that's the way we can protect everybody, is to be a barrier in between that and where they want to go do the damage. They've made it very clear that they know if they can stop the drilling or stop the company by damaging their equipment or damaging their stuff, then they feel they'll stop it. Problem is the rule of law said they can. The courts have ruled, the courts have said they can work. And what they're trying to do is they're planning a criminal attack on people who are doing their legal work. And that's why we don't stand up, because as you can see, they are backing that semi-truck up. That's how they started it last Sunday night. And as you can see off of the horizon there's large masses of people grouping up. Now, are they going to walk down there and pray and have a ceremony and then walk away almost kind of going like, well, it's like, oh, we could have come get you, but we're not tonight. And last Sunday night again, they masked up, they got the semi, and they came after us. And that's the game they play all day, every day. A lot of times we never quite know what their intent is going to be. So we gear up, we do our thing, and we hope they stand down and go back to the camp and act like orderly people.
So that was the launch of the Know the Truth videos. Just an example, and it was probably one of the longer ones, but it gave them an avenue to really get their message out there. Well, in the end, the truth prevailed over fake news. The world was watching. That was a very common theme. That when protesters were given the last chance to leave, the group who proclaimed themselves to be water protectors left a massive mess. And everyone noticed. That's an aerial view of the camp. And as you can see there, they built many structures on U.S. Army Corps of Engineer land that had no infrastructure. So we had 12,000 people there with no water, no sewer, nothing. So you can imagine. 48 million pounds of garbage and debris were cleaned off of this site. 48 million pounds. The cost to clean up this site to the state of North Dakota was $1 million. And the total cost for North Dakota to respond to this protest was $40 million. It's pretty much all at the state's expense. And I'm going to leave off there, and then at the end, I'll kind of come back and talk about the last of my slide. I can help you load it up, or do you want to do it, Melinda?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Are you on here, or is it
It's on those.
Drive?
Drive, yeah.
Oh, shoot. See, I should have let you do it.
Top one.
Okay.
Oh, you did great. Thank you. Well, wow, good morning. Hi, everybody. You awake? Yeah. Enough coffee? My name is Melinda Swan. I have had a rather eclectic career in working within media and communications and marketing for over a 30-year span. So my job this morning is, while you've just heard an amazing story about fake news and how to respond to it, my job is to give you a little bit of a philosophical perspective, if you will. And to do that, I thought of one of my favorite jokes, and I'm going to make this gender neutral because it's really not about a particular gender. But one day in church, and you can pick your choice, man or woman, sitting in a pew, big huge puff of smoke, strike of lightning, clap of thunder. Up on the middle of the beginning of the church sits the devil himself. And everybody in the congregation runs out except for this one person. And the devil says, "Don't you know who I am? Why are you still here?" She said, she said, "I know exactly who you are. I've been married to you for 37 years. And that's how I feel about fake news. It's a new phenomenon, but it's not new. It's a little bit like Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. We've had fake news since we've had real people. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that from a broader perspective. But first we need to start with some definitions. What is fake? Completely made up, intentionally false, information that we provide that we know really isn't true for the purposes of deceiving or otherwise hoodwinking people. But then there's this other variation called biased. Now, sometimes that comes in the terms of an opinion editorial or something that clearly says, this is my perspective, but sometimes it doesn't. Think about how much news you read where there, and we've had numerous studies over and over about what types of biases MSNBC has versus Fox News has. But clearly, there are some news that, while it may be factual, it's told with a particular slant, right? And let's face it, part of our jobs sometimes is to tell a story with a slant too. And then there's that thing called legitimate journalism. What does that really mean? Anybody? This is interactive. What's that? Not a clue. Yeah, thank you. Me too. Well, the reality is, I've been wondering about that myself for a very long time. The reality is, though, that legitimate journalism, at least as it was taught to me when I went to journalism school, was that you were to provide an objective analysis of what happened. You were supposed to tell people who, what, when, where, why, and how. You were supposed to do it succinctly. And you're supposed to do it in a way that they could read it and make their own conclusions. Just the facts, ma'am, right? Isn't that where that all came from? How many of you think that that is the way most journalism has been for the last 30, 40 years? Anybody? One or two? For those that do.
Not evil people. There are many of them out there trying to do a good job.
Oh, absolutely.
Vilifying them is not useful.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I totally agree with you. In fact, I've worked with journalists for many years. But I think there is a question to be asked about what types of news we have. Because when we ask about fake news, we think that it's something entirely new and different. And my point is it's not necessarily so. So, for example, the terminology fake news, according to Merriam-Webster and other sources, dates back 125 years. But the idea of it goes back even further. In 1200 BC, Ramses the Great was not feeling so great about what happened at the Battle of Kadesh, so what did he do? He built scenes into his temple showing them having a fabulous victory over the Hittites. It was actually a stalemate. Octavian, in the 1st century BC, really didn't like Mark Antony. We all remember our history of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So he portrayed him as a drunkard and womanizer and a mere puppet of Cleopatra's. And this dogged Antony all his life. And Antony eventually, as you know, ended up fighting against the Romans with the Egyptians and, finds out that here's the false rumor, the fake news that Cleopatra is dead, and reacts accordingly. The reality is we've been dealing with fake news throughout our centuries, but we've dealt with it in different kinds of ways. And where it's really been kind of interesting is in politics. I don't need to say that to many of you in this room. And we go back to the election of 1800. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. One of the biggest false news stories spread on both sides was that Adams was an Anglophile who really wanted to marry off one of his children to the King of England and reunite with the British colonies. On the other side, Thomas Jefferson was portrayed as a Francophile who was going to lead us all into anarchy and bring guillotines into the U.S. and start killing people. So neither was true, but both were published in numerous ways by pamphlets and other kinds of things. So when we think about the election of 2016, remember it happened in 1800 too. But the real question to me is more about how did we get here? And what is different about today in fake news? And I think one of the main reasons is for those of us who work in this business, this idea of a shrinking news hole. Are you familiar? Okay, yeah, it's kind of a jargony term. So when you think about a newspaper, for example, that's the easiest way to think of a news hole. There's how much space in the newspaper for actual news stories versus advertisements versus editorials, etc. When you're dealing with the news media every day, the less news hole there is, the less they can cover, or the less they can cover more thoroughly. And what has happened over the last 15, 20 years, as most of you know, is that newspapers in particular have taken a nosedive. They've lost something like 43% of their revenues from advertising and subscriptions between 2011 and 2000 to 2011. Something in the neighborhood of 45,000 journalists have lost their jobs in the last decade. And so what has happened is not only are you seeing all this change in terms of people going to the internet for news, social media has become a huge purveyor of news, and that's one of the reasons why fake news is so damaging and dangerous. But you also see this inability to fight that from the legitimate news coverage side because there's less space, less staff, less ability to really set that story straight. So that's one factor. Another factor is that rush to be first. In Friday, when I was here, I did a little presentation. We talked about a major snafu of the Washington Post, which we still consider to be one of our premier journalistic outlets, right? They were in a hurry. They had a breaking news story, came out electronically first, most stories do now, about a power plant in Vermont and whether or not it had been hacked by the Russians. And so they jumped on the story, thought they had it, went full bore with it. Within 12 hours found out that not only was there not a Russian hack, it wasn't the Russians at all, the computer in question wasn't even hooked into the network of the power grid, it was a standalone, and nothing about it was true. But that's what happens when you have to rush to be first sometimes. Those kinds of errors are going to slip through, and they can then compound themselves. As I was preparing for this today, I was looking through, and one of the things that struck me was how many websites have now been created that echo each other. Have you ever noticed this? Now, in my case, I just happened to notice it with Breitbart and some other of the more conservative ones. There's on both sides. But once that story gets out there, they all write the same thing. They might slightly rewrite it, they might put a new lead on it, but it's all the same piece, and it keeps getting respun. So what happens when you go to search? Your Google search comes up, and here's this string, and they all say the same thing, right? So suddenly you're thinking, oh, this must be right. When in fact, it's the same biased, slanted, or perhaps fake story that occurred in the first place. So that rush to be first is a huge, huge part of the problem. Some of that has to do with some of the other changes that are affecting the news media today. Technology owns us all, but tech really owns the media world. If you think about it, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, they make the hardware, they make the operating system, they make the browser, they run the email, they create the social network platforms we use to share, and share sometimes fake pictures, and they create the web platforms where we go to shop and play. Now, if this doesn't worry you a little bit, it probably should. In the 2011 Pew Charitable Trust, which does an annual review of media, et cetera, said that 5 tech companies accounted for almost 70% of all digital ad revenue. AOL bought HuffPo. Facebook bought the New Republic. AT&T and Time Warner are trying to merge. Amazon owns Washington Post. 7 corporations control 90% of the news media today. We're thinking about. So there again, that all of these things are combining together with this consolidation can add to a lot of the issues of getting through and correcting things. The rapid fire, that goes back to rushing to judgment. When I taught a class not too long ago for a couple of years at the Glenn School here locally to master's level public policy students. And one of the things that really impressed me and also surprised me was how many of my students used Twitter to get their news. They didn't look at conventional news sites at all. And so if you ever watch Twitter, anybody else in here a Twitter nut? What happens? It's like watching CNN on hyperspeed, with steroids. Those headlines float right on by, right? So all day long they're getting, and what are they getting? They're getting headlines. Do you know how easy it is to deceive people with a headline? Even legitimate news outlets, oftentimes the headline writers are not the same as the story writers. There's a myth about that. And oftentimes what the headline says doesn't necessarily correlate with what the story says. How many times does that happen to folks here? Yeah. So guess what? Now, if you're only seeing a headline, what are you taking away from all of that? And then we're going to talk a little bit here in a minute about nano attention spans. But with some of the other things that are contributing to these changes and making things more challenging have to do back with that whole shrinking news hole idea, and that has to do with the journalists that you're actually dealing with. Here locally, we have what used to be one of the few family-owned papers still left. It's now been bought by a chain. And they had to go through a serious downsizing. They lost a lot of their staff. They went from 6 editorial writers to, for a while, 1. They now have 2. And as you start looking at the bylines, you notice more and more of the reporting staff are still journalism school students at Ohio University. They're not even graduated yet. So, and I can tell you from 30 years ago that I used to warn some of the folks I work for, your most challenging interviews are going to be with student journalists because they don't necessarily have the experience to know what you're supposed to be asking and what's on, you know. So things you wouldn't expect may come up and things you would expect may not. So for all of those reasons, we talk about sort of some of the things that come up, and I thought some of Danelle's examples were excellent. Another one that happened, though, just to give you an idea, because again, this goes back to that interaction between social media and print media, was involving a guy in Texas who was a Twitter user, and he saw buses near a Trump presidential, this was still during the campaign stop, and he kind of on his own put out a tweet saying that he thought the people who were protesting there had been bussed in for that purpose. Well, that turned out, and the bus company eventually was able within about 12 hours to put a stop to it. That wasn't true. The bus was there for people who were in for a convention, and they were taking them to a particular site. But by that point, it had been picked up at like 5,500 news outlets across the country. And the president himself even put out a tweet saying, look at their, you know, they have to bus people to come in and protest me. So that's how quickly some of these things can move if you don't respond to them quickly. And that goes back to all of those issues. Nano attention spans, rapid fire news, rush to judgment. It's on Twitter, it must be true. No, not necessarily. So let's talk about that nano judgment real quickly, and then we're going to get into the good stuff about what can we do about all of this. Microsoft in 2008 did a study, and they found that the average goldfish had an attention span of 9 seconds. Anybody want to guess what the average human attention span was in 2008? 8. So there you go. Your lesson for today is we have less attention than a goldfish, okay? But there are things we can do about all of this. And I think Danelle provided a terrific case study of a lot of those things. One, of course, is get it right. You need to get out the facts as quickly as you can, as clearly as you can, with the least amount of hyperbole that you can. And when I say that, I mean use verifiable facts. You know, I've done a lot of focus groups in my life, and one of the things that I'm always astounded by is the what I call the BS meter. People's sense of credibility about information has diminished a lot. And so they don't believe a whole lot. They want to them, a verifiable fact, is something they can go to Google and find themselves and get it from a credible source. So use facts, verify them, cite those sources. Where did this come from? What objective person can help verify and validate that that is accurate? That means credible third-party sources, which is one of the reasons why, as we talked about on Friday, it makes all the sense in the world as you're thinking about the stories or the issues that you expect to be dealing with over the next year. Figure out who your allies are going to be early and work with them early. Just like I mentioned that there were news sites that echo each other, you can have allied sites that are going to echo what you're going to say and help add validity and punch and reach and frequency to what you're trying to communicate. You know, for example, working with law enforcement and having law enforcement be your spokesperson, having them bring in their networks, bring in the networks of other environmentalists who were more reasonable. All of those kinds of ideas make sense, but they have to be planned in advance. Be specific. This I know, having spent many, many years working with and for people in politics, there's often this temptation to be much more generic, much more all-encompassing and inclusive. The trouble is, nobody believes you. right? So let me give you an example. If I said, I have the most amazing dog in the world, okay? Or if I said, I have this dog that every morning brings me my slippers, helps me clean up after it in the backyard, saves babies from burning buildings, which one of those is more credible? I know I made up the last part, but so it was good fake news, okay? It's more credible because it's more specific, because it sounds real. Highfalutin, wonderful statements may make you feel good, but they're probably not going to do a whole lot for the audience you're trying to convince, or even reach for that matter. Back to get your friends to say it for you. Word of mouth, Facebook, that's what I call the echo effect. How many times could you have used some folks to share your stories on Facebook? Or redo your hashtag on Twitter and cite you. Your friends and allies, people who agree with you, will do that for you. But they have to be asked, and they have to be given the chance to do so. They can become tremendous verifications of what you're talking about. And then I think the other thing that Danelle's really pointed out that was great is recycling isn't just for cans. If you have a great story, tell it a couple different ways. Tell it with a photograph. Tell it with a video. Tell it with a podcast. Tell it in an op-ed. You don't have to come up with a whole new idea every single time. If what you're saying is valid, important, and smart, thoughtful, persuasive, find ways to repeat it. You like this picture? My last point is be very vigilant. There are lots of different services you can hire to help you track what's being said about there. Don't let stuff go unnoticed. One bad fact can haunt you for a very long period of time. It has a boomerang. What's the old story? What happens on Facebook, or what happens in Vegas lives on Facebook. You can't get away from it. People can find it 10 years later because they're Google searching for you, and there it is. Try to correct those things as much as you can, as quickly as you can. I like this guy because of the bent knee idea. Again, oftentimes I think it is tempting when you're dealing with, particularly with a adversarial kind of situation where you've got protesters on one side and you're trying to communicate through them. It's very tempting to kind of get a little self-righteous, right? Because you are on the side of right. But the reality is most people are going to listen to you more if there is what I call the bent knee effect. If you're not completely claiming that everything you've done and said is absolutely perfect all the time. No one believes that, first of all. But second of all, by keeping that bent knee, you can be reasonable. You can be a reasonable voice in a world of extremists. And for most people, they're going to pay more attention to that. That might even mean, and I know this sounds heretical to a few folks, but that might even mean sharing their argument along with why your argument is better. The old saying is you tell your own news first, and if you can tell their story for them, but then explain why your story is better in a positive, proactive, constructive kind of way, you're very much more likely to emerge from that discussion at a higher level. Make sense? And again, the multi-channel is all about using the different venues and ways you can tell a story. Now, I want to make a switch into another topic that I was asked to address this morning, which is called brand. But before I do that, any questions or comments about where we are?
I have a question.
Please.
And could you address self-selecting, because I think that is such a key component of what's happening in our country in terms of, if each of us in here, depending on whether we're right-leaning or left-leaning, we're going to be getting very different things on our phones. So could you just address that?
Sure. Do you all know what she means by self-selecting? Yeah, we're going to pick the perspective we have. And the reality is that social behavioral studies have said for a very long time that if I have a particular perspective on something and I'm pretty adamant about it, you can give me all the facts you want, you're not going to change my mind. And that happens on both sides. I think probably climate change might be one of the better examples of that recently. So the reality is you're going to have to realize that in this world of polarization, there's going to be a group of people who are going to disagree. But your role is to try to communicate both to those who support you and to those who are open-minded why you take the position that you take, and keep focusing on that. You know, it's just, as we're going to talk about in branding, it's recognizing that you have lots of different audiences, but you have to really focus on those that you have an opportunity to influence and that are going to hear you. And self-selecting affects everything. It affects what news channels they watch. It affects what books they read. It affects who they talk to. And you're not going to overcome that necessarily. And by spending time trying to, you may be wasting time you could be spending on people who are persuadable. Make sense? Please.
I wonder if you have any comments about news outlets making news that maybe doesn't exist, or in our situation, in my county, our newspaper likes to put out on Tuesday. Our meetings are generally Wednesday night, so they like to put out on Tuesday or Wednesday morning what they think we might do. And you keep telling them, you know, Tuesday it's speculation. If you wait till Thursday, it's actually news of what we did. So any suggestions on how to combat that they're trying to make something into a story that is a non-story until we actually do something?
Would you like a smart aleck answer? Give him some fake news. Have him printed on Tuesday and then have to retract it on Thursday. That might stop. No, you know, it's a great question, and I'm going to take some of the negative and turn it to a positive as I close this subject out. But, you know, maybe try giving them a checklist on Monday. Here's what's going to be up. Here are the pros and cons of it. So at least if they're going to do a preview story, maybe they'll do it more accurately. Try to, I don't know how many other media outlets you have to go to, but try to scoop them once or twice. That might also kind of give them a hint that they need to play a little more fair. Use your own networks. You know, a big thing somebody said on Friday that I thought was really important was we've got to go back a little bit and think about marketing, not just public relations anymore, and the whole network of marketing. And by that I mean we all have lots of ways of communicating outside of the earned media. Don't forget them. Those are things you can do something about and you can influence. So those would be a few suggestions. So here's the light at the end of the tunnel. Because as I talked about, I've been on 2 statewide campaigns. I've done, I don't know, 20 years in public life, something like that, and done numerous crisis communications with clients, etc. But one of the things that always frustrated me about the old school journalism was the he said, she said phenomenon. You know, if you ever remember this one? They're covering a story, what do? Well, this side said blank, and this side said blank. And what's the reader supposed to take away from that? And it would always frustrate me because I would say, okay, there's got to be some places you could go to get some third-party verification of who's telling the truth, right? It can't just all be speculation. So yesterday's dispatch made me smile. And I'm not bringing this up for political reasons. I hope, please don't look at it that way. But headline, Pence did in Indiana what he opposes about Ohio. And the whole article, it doesn't say op-ed, it doesn't say column, it's an article. But the whole article basically points out that when the vice president was here, he was criticizing Ohio's Medicaid expansion, and the reality was he'd done the same thing in Indiana when he was governor. And they went back, they had 6 or 7 great sources back and forth to verify it, but they reached a conclusion. So maybe one outgrowth of all of this is that we will begin to get news that really kind of better informs us, helps us to sort through some of this confusion, and that would be an awesome outcome. And I urge you to be part of that solution. I think that's one of the best policies I could recommend to you too. So let me quickly go through brand because I want to bring Donnell up and I want to answer all your questions and your comments. But the other thing that really matters when you're dealing with all of these media issues and fake news is what's your brand? And if we look at this, I know I'm going to see some brand bristling. We're going to talk about that. But just answer a question for me. What's your favorite brand? I threw up a couple up there that I like a lot. I'm sorry? I couldn't hear it.
Grey Goose.
Grey Goose. Oh, okay, awesome. That's good stuff.
He said absolute.
Oh, did he? Absolute. Okay, cool. Good.
Apple.
Apple. Others? Okay, for those who said Grey Goose or Absolute, you don't have to give us a lot of detail, but why? What is it when you say that word? What comes to mind?
That was just the first one that came to
I know, but that's okay. What's that? It helps to say goose. It's fun to say goose, isn't it? Yeah.
It's quality.
It's quality. Yeah. You know that because?
I've experienced.
Thank you. You just took my whole brand lesson right there. I'm done. I'll believe.
At 8 o'clock in the morning?
So I almost hate to use the word brand in a group of public sector folks, and I'll tell you why. Because whether I was at Ohio State or whether I'm working with other elected officials or other public offices at the city, state, or federal level, whenever you say the word brand, you can always see three people go. You know, right? Have you seen this? I call it brand bristling now. And the reason I say that is because the word worries them. It sounds too commercial. It sounds too cheap in selling a product, right? And we're in government. We don't do that. Well, yeah, we do. But we don't like to refer to it that way. But my personal reason for talking about brand is because at its essence, a brand is not your logo, it's not your colors, it's not even your voice or the photography or the design that you use. It is the experience people have with you. And it's the experience that you want people to have with you. And when you think about what we do for a living, isn't that really kind of at the heart? We want people to have really positive experiences with their government. We want them to feel like they're getting a good bang for their buck, that we're responsive, that we care, that we're trying to lead and not just, follow behind. So, when we think about this, the other reason why I think it's incredibly pertinent to public officials and public governments is what contributes to somebody's experience with you? Everything. How your phones are answered, what your website looks like, how tough it is to get information from you, how responsive you are, how remote you may seem. All of those things have everything in the world to do with what they think about you, the experience that they have with you, right? I'm seeing a few amens. And why does it matter? Because that's what we're here for, right? So I love this word cloud because it really communicates all of those different components in a lot of different ways. Employees. The employees that we work with every day have everything to do with the experience people have with you. Their attitude, their way of handling problems or not. Their what they say about you outside the office. We had a long talk on Friday about how employees now are the spokespersons, whether we like it or not. What they put out on Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, can be just as electrifying as what your communications person says. And I was reminded of, a few years ago, I was working with a research firm, and Duke University was one of the entities that they had worked with previously. And what they learned from Duke's research was that while it had a great national reputation, its worst problem was its own faculty. They were the ones who said the worst things about the university. So they had to really reverse some of their communications efforts to focus on that. So technology, how do you use technology to serve people? Are you more customer-centric, or do you still make them stand in line and fill out 25 forms? Those are all great questions to ask yourself. Now, if we were going through this and from a traditional private sector experience, we would go through things like values, essence, attributes, trigger points, all of those things. I don't bring those up here too much, and I don't want to dwell on them too much because I think people can get lost in those shrubs. But if you think about starting with just your mission, your vision, and the experience that you want your constituents to have with you, and begin to answer some of those questions, I think the rest of it will get much clearer. And where does it end? It doesn't. It should affect every decision you make, from the language that you're using, the design, the staff training, evaluations, all of those things should focus back on it. And why does it matter? Because A, it is a reflection of your values, and B, back to those NANO attention spans. If you don't have clear, concise experiences that are duplicated and replicated, every time you crack open a bottle of Grey Goose, it better taste great, then guess what happens to your constituents? They don't buy your brand, they don't believe your brand. And then you start losing them. And these are some of the steps and metrics that you can think about. And I have lots more on that topic, but I want to bring back up Danelle and start answering questions, unless anybody wants to talk about this right now. Great, okay.
I just want to add that one of the hard parts about combating or addressing fake news, especially from the standpoint that I was in, representing law enforcement, was the fact that they needed to substantiate whatever those claims were. You can't just respond by saying, no, this isn't true. We wanted to track it back to make sure that it wasn't true. And so that does take time. And like Melinda said, most of the damage is already caused in that time that it takes to track it back. Just want to know who are you? I want to know more about you guys. So show of hands, how many of you have communications background? Good. And then how many of you are county commissioners or other public officials that sometimes have to deal with communications? Large amount of you. I just want to pitch our group, the National Association of County Information Officers. It's a very affordable group to belong to. We have many benefits, including webinars that are usually quarterly, so it's easy to get some training from your desk in your office. It's also nice to just have the network of communications professionals really right from your computer. You can have a listserv, so you can have access to the communications professionals that work with counties or state associations all across the country. And then during these events, we have numerous trainings. We had a full day of training on Friday that dealt with communications-related topics. And during our LEDGE conference, we do the same. Everyone got a book of media relations book that's put out by the National Association of Counties. I think this is a tremendous resource. This is something that you can have on your desk and pull out if you need to write that press release. It has a template in here along with some very good information on the basics of communication. So I highly recommend that you take this home and use it, read it. It's very valuable. For more information on the NACo organization, you can go to nacio.org. So there's my pitch. We can open it up for any questions. Please.
You mentioned before media in the circumstance when you have he said, she said, and then someone comes up with an expert opinion to weigh either side. We've had frequently where it's been he said, she said, and then the media will come up with an expert that they'll find in Michigan or somebody that they can find someone somewhere to substantiate the side that they want to substantiate. So, and then you're sort of left sitting there, and they've got an expert confirming that it's correct. How do you combat that?
Well, excuse me. The first thing I would say is when you're getting ready to go into those conversations, have your own experts lined up and point those reporters to them. At a minimum, it will at least be a he said, she said among the experts, but it also may help you to press your case through. The other thing I would think about is, again, using some other allies in the community to say the same things you are. If they share your perspective, ask them to speak up, ask them to call the reporter, so that you begin to get enough information flowing in that reporter actually maybe takes a step back and examines their own perspective on it. You don't want to overwhelm them. You don't want to make but at the same time, it's okay to be assertive in trying to make sure your perspective is shared. We have a gentleman with the microphone, so we'll let him go next, and we'll be right back.
Good morning. My name is Robert Wilson. I am the Cass County Administrator in Fargo, North Dakota. And prior to my time in county government, I was a small market television reporter for 10 years. And appreciate the presentation this morning, and certainly understand that the Dapples and the Washington Post retraction that you talked about and the media consolidation, they're all going on, and no question. But I guess the point that I would want to add to this conversation is that when we're talking about, and most of us probably are in small to medium-sized markets, and if our most common interaction with our local reporters are following up, previewing items on agendas that are coming up, I would say that none of those big picture things are what are impacting the thought process and the work that these reporters are doing. And that my point that I would want us to remember is that most of the time, those are probably folks, kids, fresh out of school. They probably have 5 and 6 stories that need to be done that day. And if there's anything that we're most likely combating, it's their lack of knowledge and their lack of time to put into the story. So I would say that if there's anything that on a 95%, 90% basis that you can do to make that story, that end product better, it's just work with them. Take a little bit of time, slow down, answer some of the questions that you think may be the baseline knowledge that you and your staff and your commissioners have been working with for months. They probably don't know it. So wouldn't want to discount any of the big picture stuff that's going on at all, but that's what their reality is and what they're dealing with, and what's most of the time going to make a better story locally.
Amen. Absolutely. That is very true. And the more you can provide sort of fact sheets, timelines, background materials that help them get the story right, absolutely true. But in one sense, they are a little affected, because that's why they're fresh out of school, et cetera, is that lack of resources, and the turnover in the industry has exacerbated that, I think.
Yeah, Robert, I think you're right on with that. It just like with anything, you have to know your source. And so what we experienced was definitely the national media was really more of what was driving this, and the fake news, and also the the activists themselves. They were the instigators. So, but absolutely know the source. And also, it all comes down to relationships. It all comes down to building those relationships, getting to know your reporters, having the trust with them as they can have the trust with you.
If I may add one thing to that, I think you're exactly right, where if you're dealing with the reporters that you're dealing with on an ongoing basis all the time, totally different dynamic than when you have the folks that come in from national who have no reason to trust or build trust. Thank you.
Exactly. Please, sir.
I'm curious on the trying to find out, like, the photos, the teepees on fire, and some of that stuff. How were you guys able to go back and identify where those came from? I mean, you have like movie buffs that could. I remember watching this movie. I saw that. You know what I mean? So, what kind of resources did you have to go back and find the truth?
Well, through the process, there got to be numerous different resources that were brought in. We had intelligence guys that were not only, looking at what was going on social media and what was being said, and then combing that for criminal kind of information, but also the intelligence information. We also had worked with the National Sheriff's Association, and they partnered with some PR firms that I think were probably more instrumental in identifying some of those things as well. But when I first came on the ground, there was none of that. So we went from having no resources to having a lot of people coming in and saying that they could help.
Back to your comments on branding, and this may not be the proper forum, but what do you do when you have employees on their own personal Facebook taking shots at your county? And do we have any kind of authority to address that? Is that an issue?
Oh, yeah, that's a really long one. How long do you have? So let me tell you a quick funny story, because it helps illustrate this point. When I was at Ohio State, I was an associate VP for Community University Marketing and Communications. We had one of the first forays into Facebook, really. We were delving into it, using a Facebook page for the university a lot. And our Facebook editor posted a story about our president that promptly drew several really smart-ass responses and very critical responses. Without checking with anyone, he took them down. And the way I found out about all this was I got a phone call from the Associated Press asking me why Ohio State was now deleting people's Facebook posts on its Facebook page, which was not the most pleasant question I've ever had to answer. And of course, when it's Associated Press, I don't know, it went to 400 news outlets across the state easily, and probably more outside the state in terms of beyond that. But so the reality is, you do have to walk a fine line between free speech and inappropriate conversation. The easiest place to start is to develop a policy, and to try to develop it in advance in conjunction with your employees, and have some candid conversations, because I just had a client recently who had someone on their staff resign, and they put up a huge post on Facebook just blistering and blasting the organization. And it caught on, and it caught news coverage, and was on television, all kinds of things. They can cause a lot of damage. And yet at the same time, especially as we begin to talk about people who are more in the millennial era, they have a whole different perspective about social media than older folks do. They grew up on it. They don't, first of all, they don't have that sort of what seems like a misguided view anymore of privacy. They share everything. They assume everything's public anyway. And they're much more likely to think it's acceptable to just say what they think on, their own page. So it's not going to be a clear-cut, bright line kind of thing, but if you can at least begin to have a peaceful, positive conversation about what's constructive and what's appropriate, those kinds of things, then develop a policy in advance, it becomes a lot easier to deal with it when it happens.
Just a quick comment on social media. I think it's kind of, by definition, one of the original democratic processes.
Yeah.
Anybody.
Self-publishing.
But it's pretty interesting lately that fake news is being challenged by people in the media, or people in social media, and saying this is fake news immediately, and they're coming with sources, et cetera. So in some ways, social media can help us.
Yes.
In this issue of fake news. I think that's refreshing.
It is, and it's absolutely true. It's the democratization of the news process, right? Absolutely. It used to be if you didn't have a publishing plan or you didn't have a big, television tower, nobody heard you. Now one person can literally be heard by millions. But that whole idea of crowd policing is sort of like crowdsourcing, and so one of the things I'd encourage you to do is take advantage of that. You will find, more often than not, more reasonable, thoughtful people than you expected.
Quick question. When you had the photos that were fake, do the media respond appropriately if you asked them to check the metadata of where that photo came from, the date and the time?
I guess most of those pictures were all on Facebook and social media and were created into graphics and shared out. They were done by the protesters, the activists that were trying to stop the construction of the pipeline. They weren't really necessarily given to the media as much as they were shared through their messaging.
How soon, if at all, did your ability to go back and kind of debunk some of the photos and the assertions on social media traditional press to stop picking up photos off of social media without coming to verify that it was true?
Yeah, we didn't really have a lot of problem with the local media picking up on a lot of those graphics and things. It was more of how it was misinforming the public as a whole, across the nation and, outside of North Dakota's borders. Wanted to also hit on the partners, identifying your partners and having them echoing your message. We did bring in early on other people in the state who could kind of echo our same concerns, our messages. So, for example, there were a number of cattle that were killed in the area of the camp, and livestock producers that were being harassed and terrorized in their own yards. And so then we had the Stockmen's Association, for example, come in and talk about what they had been investigating as far as the livestock being killed and putting out rewards for information. So it was really nice to be able to identify partners who can, again, piggyback on your message and spread that message.
And I think one of the interesting things about that case study is there is a difference between social media and earned media, and they don't always intersect. But that doesn't mean you can sort of ignore it. If in this case, it was great that the earned media did not cover all of the misinformation that was on social media, but you still have to deal with the misinformation on social media because of who else it's reaching.
If I can just share, I was kind of toying with whether to put it in my example or not, but MSNBC was live on location at the protest camp for one of their live shots, and the reporter was saying how they were concerned about the flooding because they kill their buffalo and then float them down the river, and what if that's polluted by oil? Well, that's not going on. And he was informed that no, they're no longer just killing roaming buffalo in North Dakota, and he went with it anyway. The story aired, and that's a national journalist from NBC.
That's awesome.
Jess?
Feel free to ask more questions, but I'm Jessica Beyer, past president of the National Association of County Information Officers, and so I just wanted to thank both presenters today. This is a very timely topic, so thank you. Thank you for all attending. If you do want to learn more about NACo, please leave your business cards or get in touch with us. We always recommend, counties, if at all possible, can have a public information officer, communications person, but a lot of counties with resources and budgets don't, but you have people filling those roles. They are still welcome to become part of our membership. It's $85 a year. We've been having quarterly, actually as of this last year, monthly webinars, and so we just really encourage you. Communications touches everyone, and so we hope you look at our membership as a partner of NACo. So thank you. Thank you for attending today.